Hi, I'm Chris Long, president of the Center for Public Policy Innovation, a nonpartisan think tank whose mission is to help educate government officials on new policy associated with innovation and the rapid advancement of technology. Workforce issues have a major impact on U.S. economic growth and prosperity. I'm pleased to host today's Policy Insight on the future of the American workforce. Leading today's discussion is Randy Dove, a longtime member of the CPPI Board of Directors. He's a principal at Dove Government Relations and a mentor at McDaniel College in Wesminster, Maryland. Randy had a long career in Washington, D.C. in government relations and communications with HP and EDS, and he served 13 years as a senior staffer for the late Senator Charles Mathias, Jr. of Maryland. Randy's an expert on workforce issues. Joining him is local radio news legend Tom Temin from the Federal News Network. Thanks to you both for being here. I look forward to your discussion on the future of the American workforce.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to today's discussion. The public and private sector workforces are facing many challenges these days, as everybody knows. And that's from getting and keeping the right people to navigating through the different government regulations and contract and acquisition rules here in the market here. We also facing the challenge of understanding what workers need and what they want these days. And are our government managers equipped to manage people in this post-pandemic era? And what innovative steps can we take to ensure that we have the best people and solutions in both the public and private sector workforces? To discuss these issues today, as Chris mentioned, privileged to have with us one of the foremost observers of the government and private workforces, as well as where they intersect with technology and policy, Tom Temin of the Federal News Network. Tom, welcome to CPPI, and we look forward to your comments. A couple of words about Tom. Since 2007, he has been the host anchor of the Federal Drive with Tom Temin, which can be heard daily from 6 to 10 a.m. on 1500 a.m. in the D.C. area and 104.5 FM in the Dallas corridor. It's also streamed at federalnewsnetwork.com and available as a subscription podcast wherever you get all your shows. Overall, Tom has more than 30 years of experience in the market. And prior to Federal News Network, he was editor-in-chief of Government Computer News and Washington Technology. And in the interest of full disclosure, I've known Tom since the early 1990s when he was at GCN and I was at EDS and he was covering us and I was trying to put together a media relations office for EDS, who was notoriously shy at the time. But we did have some good work together, and thanks for being here today. And let's just start generally. What is the state of the federal workforce these days?
Well, Randy, it's great to be with you and good to reconnect after all these years. I guess that makes us both oldies but goodies since we remember what EDS was all about.
Yes.
Sometimes it comes up and I have to say, hey, kids, there was a company called EDS, that had computer services before cloud computing. So Nothing is new necessarily under the sun. The state of the federal workforce, in my opinion, is pretty strong right now. I think that the workforce is actually held in better esteem by the general public than you might find out on, cable news and some of the noisy parts of the partisan parts of the country in Washington. But there's a good, strong federal workforce. There is a growing federal workforce at this point. I mean, it's been pretty stable in terms of numbers for a couple of decades. But because of the recent spending by Congress, good or bad, we've had trillions of dollars in new spending programs in just the last 3 years outside of regular appropriations. And so the government is now in the midst of hiring, by some estimates, up to 100,000 people to carry out the programs spawned by these spending. So, it's pretty solid right now.
It is contrary to what most people are saying. And I think that the point that it is pretty strong indicates that there's still a desire for government service and to be part of the federal workforce. Is it as good as it once was? Are people still desiring a federal government position?
I think they are. I mean, there are a lot of people, especially in the technology area, which is a pretty broad area from, IT management to networking to all of this data management and so forth, customer experience. And we can talk about more of those later on. But a lot of people are coming in mid-career, not necessarily to join a new career, but for the express purpose of serving in the civil service, not political appointees. I'm talking about people that come in to do a specific thing for a specific agency and mission with the expectation they'll be there 2, 3, 4, 5 years maybe, and then go back to the private sector. You see them all over the place. And the funny thing is sometimes they think they're only going to be there for a couple of years and end up staying for the rest of their careers. So you see this at GSA, at Veterans Affairs, a lot of places where people are coming in because they do believe in the mission. And, again, if you watch social media or watch cable television, I think you'd get the wrong idea about the workforce and about people's attitudes toward federal service. This is a country, from what I've been able to see, that still values public service and still values serving.
Right. And I think especially in the Washington area, we have a lot of things that people maybe don't realize, but they are certainly world-leading institutions that are government organizations like NIH, NIST, Goddard Space Flight Center, the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, and the Patuxent Wildlife Center. These are all world-leading research organizations and have many top-flight people working there on solutions that affect people all around the world.
No doubt about it. And if there is a major medical effort that's happening anywhere in the country, at least in part, it's being funded or even directed by the NIH. I don't know, what are there, 22 institutes within the NIH. It's a very, very large agency. And so, yeah, this is a locus of research, of development, of new strategies, of healthcare innovation, data analytics, and don't forget the Pentagon. There are a myriad of initiatives, maybe not located in here. Some of them are in this area, but nationwide, the Pentagon, even though it is not the originator of a lot of new technology the way it might have been in the 1950s, it is still a catalyst in what it spends on in so many areas that we need to be nationally competitive in. So, and I think people realize that to stay ahead in health care, to stay ahead in national defense, to stay ahead in strategic issues like quantum computing, cybersecurity. Some of them sound arcane. Some of them are well known to people. They're all important. And I think people understand that the federal government, for better or for worse, is a big role in all of these national efforts. We just had a successful launch back toward getting people back to the moon. And,
Right.
It takes a big country to put a thing like that up in space.
Absolutely. It's encouraging to hear about the strength of the workforce and obviously the work that's being done. But is it a desirable goal for younger people these days?
Well, that's a debatable question. I mean, I think it is. And I think the government often gets in its own way with respect to getting people in. I think only 2% of the federal workforce is Generation Z, those that are born up until 2012. Well, there's not too many 11-year-olds working anyway, I hope. But, the people that are 20, 25, 30, that's a very small percentage of the federal workforce. And it's also the section of the federal workforce that is the most volatile. It leaves the most. Whereas when you get into people in their mid-30s to mid-50s, they tend to not leave the government. Very low turnover rate of people at that age. And then, of course, when people hit 60 and beyond, then there's a lot of departure rates from the government. Well, of course, they're retiring. But I think we can overestimate the fact that Generation Z is not in the government because they're not in anywhere very long. This is the time of life when you try different careers, when you try different jobs. I had personally, by the time I was 25, I had 3 or 4 different jobs. Then I settled in and I was with a company the next 17 years. So I think it's easy to overinterpret what's going on. But on the other hand, that's not to absolve the government from some of the issues it has with the length of time it does take to hire people. And then it can be a regulated environment. But I think also young people understand that it's not the government that you work for. It's a particular agency, bureau, office, department with a particular mission. And in that case, it can be fantastic, or it can be really a downer depending on where you end up, because you've got an organization of 2 million people. Not every place is a great place to work.
Thinking about that, and you know, obviously, as the federal workforce and ages, you need to start backfilling and developing that bench. And there's some innovative programs out there that we're starting to see, and one of them that's of interest to me is that the state of Maryland recently announced that they were eliminating the college degree requirement for thousands of state jobs, and instead that they were looking at what relevant experience people might have to bring to bear for that government job, and be able to, you know, perform for the government of the state of Maryland, but without having a college degree requirement. If you have an AA
Right.
or a equivalent experience, then they want to bring you on. Is there those type of things that we're seeing in the federal government being tried?
Well, as a matter of fact, the federal government has a word for that, and the word is SQUEMA. And what that stands for, excuse me, SMEQA. I said it wrong. It's SMEQA. That stands for Subject Matter Expert Qualification Assessment, which means the same thing. If you are qualified by experience and demonstrable skills, then it really doesn't matter if you have a master's degree in mid-century Flemish art. What it needs is the government needs the skills you have. And another, even to build on that point, I spoke just the other day with one of the top cybersecurity officials in the federal government, and she was saying that, you know, you don't necessarily have to have a relevant degree even to be able to do the work. For example, in the intelligence community, for looking at the world in odd ways or looking at it through a different angle to better understand something that might be needed in the intelligence mission, they like history graduates and English graduates as much as they like foreign policy or any of the technical fields, because they want diversity of thinking and of how people approach problems. So it works both ways. You can have a degree that doesn't seem to be related, but it's something the agency could use because of the vector of thought you bring to it. On the other hand, you may not have a degree, but if you're really good at coding and you know how to build that next wave of digital services in a DevSecOps pipeline, then they'll take you, degree or not. So yes, that is definitely happening in the federal government.
You mentioned coding and the needs of the intelligence community and things like that. You know, are we getting the right people for government these days? Are we getting the right skills? I know cyber is a huge issue, and the need will never go away. Are the government agencies getting the people with the right equipment and the right ideas and the right thinking to protect obviously all the critical infrastructure the government has, but also in the private sector as well?
So no, the government doesn't have all of the people it needs. I don't think any large organization has precisely the work balance that it needs in the different areas. And it's always shifting, but it's not for lack of trying. And, you know, as you know, the government operates under merit systems principles. These are enshrined in law and statute and regulation so that you have competitive hiring, because that is to keep the government from becoming a total spoil system, so that everybody's hired politically and not just the people in the plum book when the administration changes. But within the merit systems and within competitive hiring, as OPM likes to point out, there are many, many flexibilities that people can use, 124 different flexibilities for direct appointment, for critical needs, or for very hard to find types of things, for medical appointments and so forth. And there's a couple of new rules out from OPM. One of them allows agencies to bring in people that are still in college. I guess they take a year off, work for the agency, go back, and they are required to get their degree, but then they can come back and get a direct appointment in that agency at a GS 11 level. The same thing for recent grads. There is flexibility now for direct appointment at the GS-11 level. And you see this happening as well. So that's one way they're doing it. And the other way is internships. And we can talk more about those if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Internships have, listen, I got my start in politics as a college internship on Capitol Hill. And without that internship, I don't know what path I would have taken. But interns are certainly key, a key way. And it's one of the things I talk about when I'm mentoring students at McDaniel is that, take all the internships you can find. Because you're going to get skills and it may lead to a job. So your observations on internships.
Yeah, I think a good example is the State Department. They have 5 or 6 annual internship programs for everything from diplomatic jobs for people that want to do the direct foreign service to diplomatic security, which is law enforcement, but they have a big need for law enforcement around the world. So if you want to be a diplomat or you want to drive a big sedan backwards real fast with a gun, you can do that at the State Department, and they have internships for those. I heard about one internship program just the other day at Homeland Security for acquisition people. I thought, acquisition? Who wants to do that? Well, it turns out that for business graduates, federal acquisition is actually an attractive career because it's complex. There's a lot to sink your teeth into. And again, there's that public service mission, plus the interaction with industry and the market research and so forth. So internships are increasingly, I think, being seen as a way to get in that Generation Z, younger talent. I don't know what we're going to call the next generation after Generation Z, zero.
During the pandemic, remote work became a necessity for government and private industry alike. And then even before the pandemic hit, the government was experimenting a lot with remote work or remote work centers or different things like that. Where does all that stand today? I mean, are we going to still have a part of the workforce working remote? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? The private sector, there's more and more call for people to come back to the office, whatever that means. It's different places. But where do you see from the federal government perspective?
Well, I see agencies floundering around to try to figure out what it is they want people to do, because, as you say, the siren call to come back does not fall on sympathetic ears, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. So I think what we're seeing is, unless there is a time and place requirement for a job, again, law enforcement, for example, border patrol, transportation security officers, obviously, are on the job, place and time types of based work. But for everyone else, what you're seeing, I think, is just the settling into this hybrid mode where, can you come in 1 or 2 days a week? Otherwise, you can work remotely, because they saw that the jobs do get done and the technology base is in there. And in fact, in the 3 years or so of this has all been going on, the agencies have almost totally revamped their technology base to support this type of thing on a permanent basis. And so I think you're not ever going to see the people going back to the hives of federal agencies that they used to be any more than in corporate life. The big question everyone has now, how come the roads have gotten so crowded if nobody's going back to work en masse? That's one of the great mysteries that we haven't solved yet. But the government is not all that different from industry that way. And I think it's, it's a constant interplay of people's personal desire, work-life balance, needs of the organization. What might be missing is managerial competence in overseeing a workforce where you can't see the noses and count the tops of heads every day. And that's kind of an eternal issue.
Yeah, and that leads to another question. Are the managers in the federal government getting the support and education knowledge that they need to, it's an age-old conundrum, because, do you take time away from delivering your services and delivering to your constituency, or should you be focusing more on learning new skills and how you balance that? And are we doing enough to help federal managers navigate the new world?
Yeah, probably not. And I think that's an eternal condition because real formal training takes time away from the job. And so I think that it's always going to be haphazard. There are federal training institutes, there are acquisition institutes, there are managerial institutes, retreats, and so forth of structures that have been in place for decades. And you don't get thousands and thousands and thousands of people a year going to those things. So really, the military remains the top training organization, on the earth, really, the U.S. military. But I think I see government continuing to struggle with that. A lot of agencies are experimenting with trying to move people around within the organization with the people they have. I think in the State Department, they call it the training float, where you have people filling in while someone else is trained for a new job, because they definitely recognize the need for their people. Federal managers see the need for their people to obtain new skills. And there are definitely new skills needed, lots of them in the government. And so you can hire it or you can train it. And I think they're trying to do both, on both fronts. And do you want to know what some of those skills are?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a couple: public health, climate, and energy science is huge. You see interagency collaborations on almost everything connected with energy and climate you can think of. Auditing, data analysis, the financial management, always a big need, a growing need. Customer experience, and not only because the Biden administration put that in an executive order. You and I remember George H.W. Bush administration called this the service to the citizen movement. Now we call it customer experience. So each administration has built on the idea that as technology advances and as the, if you will, private sector or retail state of the art advances, the government services should try to keep up. So, but customer experience demands new skills different than it did 25 years ago. And there's a word we're hearing emerging called product management, which is not program management and it's not project management, but it's looking holistically at what it is you're delivering and then bringing in project and programs to bear on that product. And you see this in industry and you're seeing it grow more and more in government. So the skills, needed in the bureaucracy are always evolving.
We, in the recent pandemic, and coming out of it, we saw, different attitudes towards work taking place. And do we see that? What was in the private sector being mirrored in the government sector? It sounds like not, but I'm just curious as to does the federal workforce have the same set of problems?
In my experience, they don't. I mean, I see the federal workforce as pretty darn hardworking. Now, several 100,000, maybe 1 million federal employees are covered by bargaining contracts. But, you can't bargain over really necessarily, you can't bargain at all over pay and benefits. So you take that out of the equation, a lot of the work rules and so forth. But even within the bargaining units, I think you find people pretty dedicated to the job. So I don't know about this quiet quitting concept. If it's happening in the government, I haven't seen it. And I think that in an organization of 2 million people, you have a bell curve, and it's a really big one because you've got 2 million people. So there are stellar performers and there are always laggards. Just that's human nature. That's not anything inherent in government. But I think, the public spirit is mostly there. And I don't sense, and I haven't seen any evidence that there is this kind of quiet quitting going on. By most measures, the productivity has stayed the same through the pandemic or gotten better in some cases.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful and encouraging. And I'm going to try to get you out of the interview on this question and let you sum up whatever you might want to. But what do you see as the future of the workforce, government, and also to the extent of, what's the DC private sector workforce interacting with that? And that where do we go from here? What are the next things kind of thing? anything else you want to throw in before we throw it back to Chris?
Well, I think that the idea of the A76 competitions where you compete public sector jobs with the private sector, that got pretty much killed off a few years ago, and I don't see any movement to resurrect that. So the government workforce is fairly stable within a couple of 100,000 range. Again, it was about 2.5 million around the Clinton administration time period. Then there was the reinvention of government, and the workforce fell under the Clinton administration. Maybe it's crept back up a couple of 100,000 since then. The numbers vary all the time, but yet what we as a society ask the government to do keeps growing, you know, with the infrastructure bill and this bill and that bill and the pandemic relief and so forth. And so there's no choice but to rely more on contractors. So what used to be a competition between government and contractors for the same work, that's gone. What you have nowadays is government seeking the best ways to bring in the private sector to carry out under government tutelage these big public missions. So I think that you're not going to see a fundamental change in the size of the federal government. I think you will see continued growth in the private workforce that supports the government. And that's just the way it is now until we, you know, you can agree or disagree politically with the growth of government and the growth of programs, but that's the society we've voted in, and that's the one we have. And so I think in general, we've got a pretty darn good workforce that is committed to doing things fairly, to living within the administrative procedure confines that are presented to the government so that they treat individuals and groups fairly. And there's always exceptions, but I don't think anyone would trade our relationship as a public with our federal government with probably any nation in the world.
We thank you very, very much for your time today and your insights. They were very, very helpful and very encouraging. Intuitively, I think we've always known that the government has done good work and good things, but hearing your observations, I think, certainly reinforces it. But it also says we got to keep working and we got to keep helping. We got to make sure that the managers and workers have the equipment, the technology, the leadership that they need to keep up the high standards they've already set. So again, thank you for your time, and we'll bring Chris back on.
Thanks so much.
Tom Temin and Randy Dove, thank you for the outstanding conversation on the future of the American workforce. And thanks to our audience for tuning in today. More policy insights can be found on our website, cppionline.org, and on the CPPI YouTube channel. Have a great day.